I don't know what's going on with the climate. What I do know is that we've got geoengineering over our skies. I remember somebody telling me that 20 years ago, and I thought they were completely mad that that couldn't happen. And yet that's sort of common knowledge now with a lot of people. So I don't know the truth about what is happening on the climate. What I do know is that in the UK, it is being brought in to restrict us, to take away our freedoms and life.
Hello there, I'm Zahra Sethna, host of the Collapse Life podcast, where we pride ourselves on talking to people who see the world differently. Thanks for being with us. If you like peeling back the layers on the so-called normal world, hit the subscribe button now and share this conversation with others who might appreciate it. Many people dream of leaving the urban world behind and trying a more radically simple life. Not everyone does it, but our guest today pulled it off. Decades ago, she and her husband boldly left their city life and went farming. Since then, they've moved to downsize their lives with intention as they age. She's Susan Harley, author of the Courageous Conversation Substack. Susan is a former corporate trainer, an e-learning entrepreneur, and she's one of a small group of collapse-aware people in the United Kingdom. What makes her a compelling guest, and the reason I'm so excited to speak to her today, is that she's very clear-eyed about collapse, specifically in the UK context. But she's also working to build an island of sanity in an insane world. And today we'll explore what that means. Susan, a very warm welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a privilege, and I'm excited to talk to you.
Us as well. So my producer and I had a pre-interview with you yesterday, and it was very clear to us that we could go on for hours because we have so much synergy and so much in common. And so I'm very excited to share some of your story and learn more about you. So let's just start with the journey that I mentioned. What prompted you and your husband to leave behind your big city life and move to the countryside?
It was about 24 years ago, and I was still in corporate life. And I went to a business leaders conference about climate change. And one of the speakers was from our city's county council, that's the local sort of government. And they said that it had been such a hot summer that there was serious water shortages, which they were really concerned about in the city. And they had asked the government permission to put standpipes in the street. It was so serious. And the government had refused, saying it would only panic people.
Explain what that means. Does that mean that they would actually curtail water use in your house, and you would have to go out to the street to carry your water back in?
Absolutely. You'd be down to a bucket in a queue. And it really set me back that things were that serious.
So 24 years ago, this that kind of, I mean, almost scare tactic was not as common as we find today. I think that must have been quite surprising. So it obviously shook you up, and you guys made a pretty radical decision to change your life. How was that received by other people around you?
Well, it was rare, but remember, it was at a time when climate change, as it was called then, was very much in focus. And one of the things that they thought would happen was water shortages
Mm.
and oil and all those other sort of resources running out. And when I started to talk to people about it, and I spoke to family that I didn't think we would be safe in the city, that it wasn't going to be a good place to be if things were going to be scarce, they thought I was completely mad and called me a doomer.
Was it the water shortage itself that worried you, or the decision by the council to take away your own sovereignty?
It was the water shortage. I don't think they were using it as a scare tactic. I think he was being very truthful that the city was running out of water. And it was really about informing myself, as I did from that point on, with things like peak oil and watching the end of suburbia and all the things that were current, that this way of life was no longer sustainable.
Interesting. And did the water ever actually run out?
No, it never did. And we chose to come to the southwest of England because it has a lot of rain. but we
Yeah.
have droughts here now. It's really
No way.
interesting.
Wow, that is interesting. So talk about that move. You left city life, corporate life. You moved out to a farm. Did you have farming experience? How did that transition go?
We had no farming experience. I had never lived in the country
Okay.
side. I had always lived in a city or the suburbs. We were incredibly naive. We bought an old farm. I say old because it was still farming, but on a much smaller scale. And it had a wood, which we thought would be brilliant for getting our wood and all the rest of it. But we found out it was what's called a wet wood, and everything is literally wet. And we so we had to plant more trees. And yeah, we learned the hard way. There was a lot of challenges
Mhm.
moving like that and not really knowing what we were doing.
Was there ever a moment when you thought, "Oh dear, we should probably just pack up and go back to the city?"
Occasionally, I thought about moving back to the city because of family. I left family and a fairly new grandson. He was only 2 years old at the time, and
Mhm.
I had been part carer for him, but not the lifestyle. I love the lifestyle. Both of us had been running businesses for a number of
Mhm.
years, very successfully, and we were very fortunate that we could exit them in the way that we did. Um, and it was a great way to be a gardener, to just decompress from all of those stresses and strains. So I fell in love with living in the countryside, even though it was tough. It was a relief. Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is the dream, as I mentioned in the intro, it's the dream that so many of us have to be able to just have that simple life. I think a lot of people think that you end up slowing down and not being as busy. And I think one of the misconceptions is that actually living in the country, you have even more to do. It's just a very different type of task, but you never really slow down in that type of life. Is that right?
yeah, I say that's correct. What's the difference is it's a lot more physical
Mm.
and a lot more rewarding because you actually do see things for your effort. But sometimes it's really disappointing. I mean, one of the things I learned about through gardening and growing my own food is an appreciation of food, because you're really up against it. Everything in the world is conspiring for that sort of food not to reach your table. Yeah,
Yeah, it's not as easy as it looks. It really is incredible. So, but it makes, I think, when you grow your own vegetables, certainly it makes that food taste so much better when you realize how much has gone into it and how what a fine balance it is.
absolutely. And all the hard work that goes in and all the people involved in getting food to our table. Yeah, made me much more food conscious.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So when you moved to the country, did you move to a traditional farming community, or was it people like yourselves who had moved from the city to kind of have a more quiet life?
No, what we hadn't appreciated was that it was a very conservative agricultural area. And the people were lovely, and they were miles away from where we had lived and how we were, and they saw how naive we were, and probably called us stupid. That we were outsiders coming in and buying land and farm and all of those things, and socially it was quite isolating.
Mm. So talk about I know you'd mentioned when we spoke earlier that you went from the larger farm to a kind of a smaller homestead, and one of the things that changed for you then was actually a focus on community. So talk a little bit about that.
We decided after 3 years, and having set it up and refurbished barns and houses and all of those things, that it really wasn't the right place for us. It was too isolated. So our next house hunt involved looking for somewhere which had a community
Hmm.
and a social life. And we found somewhere which is a little pocket of a very artistic community. We have filmmakers, musicians, and a very involved community. So that had all the right signs for us to then try and find a house. It was a very different way of house hunting.
Yeah. So the social scene sounds amazing, but were you also looking for like-mindedness in terms of your outlook for the future? So talking to people who um, similarly had concerns about a changing environment or the economy or things like that. Was that also one of the considerations?
One of the considerations, and the big box that it ticked, because at the time we were very concerned about the climate. So we met other people who were concerned about the climate. There were moves to start what's called a transition town, which is transforming into a low carbon lifestyle. So we really felt that we were with kindred spirits. What's changed over the years is they still think climate change is the main concern. We no longer think that. One of the things that's happened over the time, and the different sort of evolutions that I've had, and particularly during COVID, when we started to question the narrative of the figures just didn't stack up, and that there weren't people dying in the streets and there wasn't this happening and all of those things. And then the draconian measures coming in, we really questioned it. And what we found, and also the medical mandatory, certainly not official in this country, but was very much a social pressure. Those of us who refused it were in a minority.
Mm. It's so interesting how, I mean, that phenomenon happened here in North America, both in the US and Canada. I know it happened in many places in Europe, and um, it's isolating again, but in such a different way, because the people with whom you shared a worldview suddenly became people who no longer saw the world the same way as you. I know that happened to us in a number of cases, and I think that's probably happening in the UK as well. Although I'll have you talk about that.
I think it had a tremendous effect. I think that not massively, certainly not with the majority, but like us, people started to question other things as well. Because if we weren't being told the truth about that, and we were being lied and manipulated, then what other things weren't true and what other things were going on. And then I really started to, well, my husband as well, started to look at the whole climate change aspect
Hmm.
and recognize, and I don't know what's going on with the climate. What I do know is that we've got geoengineering over our skies. I remember somebody telling me that 20 years ago, and I thought they were completely mad that that couldn't happen. And yet that's sort of common knowledge now with a lot of people. So I don't know the truth about what is happening on the climate. What I do know is that in the UK, it is being brought in to restrict us, to take away our freedoms
Mm.
and life. I was recently in London, and the taxi drivers are finding it really difficult financially to survive because of the net zero policies and the speed limits and where they can go and where they can't go. And they all have to have electric cabs.
Wow.
It has become draconian.
Wow. And you do find that other people are questioning those things like you, or are you in a minority?
Still in the minority. Most people, it's business as usual. And yet I'm regarded as odd or conspiracy theorist. And I find that, yeah, there's very few people that I could actually share or trust to have that conversation with.
Right. I know that the UK is quite similar to Canada in the sense that people are quite compliant, and there's still a lot of trust in the system that has brought them this far to this day. How do you think that kind of impacts the policies that are happening? So if people are trusting the system, it allows the government to bring in ideas, policies that may work against us in some ways, for the common good. For this is what we need to do. It might be hard, but we all have to do it together. That kind of thing. Do you find that people tend to just kind of nod their heads and go, yeah, yeah, we have to do it?
Yeah, I do. I think there's still strong beliefs that the government's working for our common good, that compliance and apathy are very prevalent, not questioning. And I think that has enabled our government to bring in things which are against our interests.
Mm. What happens when people do push back or try to protest?
It's really difficult in the UK now. I mean, one of the things that I'm noticing as I follow geopolitics and yes, particularly what's happening in the States and various parts of the world, what's happening in the UK, it's all by subterfuge. So we don't have a Trump who everybody's like screaming about, whichever way they choose to view him. But we have a lot of secrecy and betrayal and things going on, like more UK journalists being arrested, Keir Starmer signing us back up to the EU in various ways, so we'll be paying taxes to them. So there are various major changes going on, but they're going on mostly unnoticed. And
Mm.
if people do protest, they're dealt with very heavily and hard, and equally, other protests are organised, from what I can understand of what's happened even last week, is that if people gather to protest against the government, then another protest turns up and calls all that start shouting at these people that they're all racists. Um, so either deliberately or just by hapstance, that there had happened to be two protests going on at the same time, they're getting us to fight amongst ourselves.
Yeah, that is definitely something that we see happening. I mean, we certainly see it through the media and the social media. We don't necessarily see it in our own lives, but it looks very much like there are tactics at play that are trying to keep us apart from each other and deliberately. There are a few things that you mentioned that I want to follow up on. One is just this what we're hearing coming out of the UK is that freedom of speech is really being curtailed, and that people have to be very careful about what they say on social media, but also live in person. I mean, you've mentioned journalists being arrested, but just your everyday person, when they post something on Facebook, also now has to be very alert to what that might mean for their lives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's a growing awareness that everything we post online is being stored, and it's becoming dangerous. It's particularly dangerous to say anything about Palestine.
Mm,
I personally was taken off Facebook when I organised a charitable sale for medical aid for the Palestinians, and I was told I'd broken the community guidelines.
really?
Uh, so that's not dangerous, but it was information, and the censorship is incredible. And yeah, I think it's going to increase because we're seeing people being arrested. We're seeing a group of young people who are in a Quakers meeting having the police break the door down because they were talking about Gaza. Yeah, it's becoming even more crazy.
It must be very unsettling because that's not what you would expect to find. I mean, through my lifetime, your lifetime, those aren't the kinds of things that we had to watch out for.
But this is indicative, isn't it, Sahara, about how everything's changing and how quickly it's changing, and that the threat to us isn't climate change, it's our own governments and our leaders and the corporations, and that we have to make decisions about what we're going to do. Are we going to stop speaking out and be scared of them?
Mm.
Because, or are we going to continue speaking, recognizing they can't arrest all of us? And if they arrest me, they arrest me now. That's my view.
That's so interesting. I mean, frightening, but I love that sense of resistance that you have. Just talking about our leaders and also how they're doing things that we may not be paying enough attention to. You mentioned Brexit very briefly, and I wanted to just unpack that a little bit because um, you know there are certainly going to be Brits who didn't vote for that, but overwhelmingly through a democratic process, that was the decision that the country made to exit the EU. And now you're saying that 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 decision is being undermined by the current prime minister. Talk a little bit more about that.
Um, it's hard to know what their motivation is. Obviously, they weren't happy that the general populace voted to come out. They weren't expecting it, and that caused a lot of division and really anger, a lot of anger. In my town, you couldn't actually say what you voted
Mm.
if it wasn't the way that everybody else voted. And I voted for it from a collapse perspective, as Britain as a lifeboat. And what's happened is all the things that were promised haven't been delivered. And
Mm.
now they're taking us back in, and particularly to do with the military and alliances they're making and talking about war and Ukraine and all of those things. So
Right.
it's an incredible betrayal of the British people.
It is. It is, regardless of how you feel about that vote itself. If you voted for anything, and then that was just if the leadership just says, "Well, it doesn't really matter what you think, we're doing it anyway." I mean, that is a huge betrayal. But I think it's also a reminder, and it's not just in Britain. It's pretty much everywhere now that a lot of the a lot of the politics is just artifice. Things are going to happen the way they're going to happen, regardless of how we vote necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're powerless or helpless, and as you said, we need to stand up and speak out when we see something happening. And if they arrest us, they arrest us, but they can't arrest all of us. So I think we'll get there. We'll talk a little bit about finding that courage and getting back to the name of your Substack. But I just wanted to make that point that I think we feel though as though our duty is done on election day, and then we can just leave it there. But that's clearly more and more evident that that is not the case.
Well, I'd go even further than that. One of the things that these experiences have taught me is that's not where our power is, and that I even question, what does a government do? What do we need, and are there other ways of governance that we can explore, that we can create together?
Mm.
Because that old system is corrupt and brutal. I mean, the only way that they've ever maintained is through the state use of violence. And
Mm.
I think for the majority of people, that's not what they want in their lives and in their world. It's a very small minority, and we have to find ways where the majority who want peace can bring about these changes.
Yeah. I mean, that is one thing that it's now reaching here in North America, but in Europe, the idea that war is at the doorstep is very it's very real right now. In in your lifetime, in my lifetime, we've heard about all the wars that happened, but we haven't lived through it. And now all of a sudden it seems like across Europe the leaders are trying to prepare the people for what might happen if war. I mean, there is already the Ukraine conflict, which is right on your doorstep, but everything makes it sound like there's going to be more. Um, how is that playing out amongst your community? Are people paying attention to that? Are they feeling that?
I don't think they are. I haven't noticed that. Again, I think a lot of people choose not to notice.
Mm.
If anything, they regard as too awful to comprehend,
Right.
then they just ignore. But I did have an interesting conversation with my grandson, who's 21, about getting a dual passport.
Really?
Because the last thing I would want to happen, and he's investigating that, is for him to be called up.
Right.
And that is something I really would mobilise about if they started calling the young people up. And they have been talking about that. They are generally gearing us up because it will help them out of all sorts of problems, and it is a major distraction.
It's really interesting. I am so curious to hear what a 21-year-old view of this world might be. are you finding that your grandson's generation is more eyes wide open than, say, maybe your daughter?
Ooh. Yes. I can talk to my grandson about these issues quite openly. Yeah.
So interesting.
He's much more receptive to it, much more aware. Yeah.
Um, So a second passport is another thing that's suddenly become almost a trend happening. For someone who's British, what would that look like? Because very often for other people, people in North America might think about going to a European country. If you're in the UK, is that would that second passport look like a country in Europe or somewhere completely different?
I think it's just in which ones you could have access to, and he could have
Hmm.
access to an Australian one through his father.
Interesting.
But as someone said, Australia is pretty similar, and they would be calling them up as well. So I don't know. I think it in these times. I think it's important to be where you're known, and not to be the foreigner or the stranger. Wherever you are, I think it's really vital now that you're somewhere safe with people you feel safe with, as
Yeah.
much as you
Well,
can.
I think that idea of safety is such an interesting one because, when it comes to the plans that are being made well above our heads, nowhere is safe really. I mean, if you're talking about um, surveillance states and 15-minute cities and the plans that are being made in the name of climate change to help the environment by, ending animal agriculture, things like that. Those plans are going to happen anyway, and nowhere will be safe from it. But being somewhere where you have control over your own destiny, where you have, like-minded people that you can pull together with, I think those are the kinds of things that make us relatively more safe, I suppose.
They are, I think. I mean, one of the questions you asked me yesterday was what would I do differently? Because in my sort of collapse journey, and if I was younger, I'd still do this, is I would set up intentional communities. I was listening to Derek Brose of Conscious Resistance, and they have bought some land in Mexico,
Hmm.
and they are carefully vetting the people. There's only be a very small number of people, families, and each would own their own plot with their house on, but they would have collective ownership of the resources, the land and the orchards and things like that. Because one of the hard lessons I've learned, and the reason that we stopped our self sufficiency living the dream, was because it's hard work and we were getting older. And unless you have intergenerational or other people you can share it with, then you don't have a contingency plan, a legacy plan in any way. And also, you have to make a decision about how you'll defend it. And I
Mm.
think that's one of the most important things for the collapse aware is, and some people are doing this, and I don't knock it. And I think it's particularly in America, where you don't have such a dense population as we have in the UK, and you also have very different relationship to guns, that
Yes.
they're taking the defence route. Um, we made a decision that that wasn't the way we were going to go. But we do have the benefit of our age. And yeah, I feel very blessed to be getting old now. Um, but if I was younger, those would be some of the tough decisions that I think I'd be having to make.
Yeah. They are tough because you want to be in a position where you and your family can make your own decisions without having to be imposed upon, but at the same time be amongst other people who can help you out when you need that extra help, or you can't do everything yourself in order to be self-sufficient. It's impossible. There's just not enough hours in the day. So that is a fine balance, and I'm eager to see how it works for Derek and his community in Mexico. Um, we all know that when you get humans together, it's never easy, even with the best of intentions. It's always hard to get everybody to see things the same way and to pull their own weight. So, yeah, it's an interesting. Did you? Did you go through that kind of experience in an intentional community, or that's just an idea that you would have done if you had more time?
I looked at it, and we did visit some, but we decided it wasn't for us. I think you have to relate to the people. You have to have, I think you have to have rules and responsibilities.
Yeah.
I think that you have to be very clear with each other, and we didn't find that.
Hmm.
And I think that would be very hard to find, but it's worth looking. It's worth considering, especially if you're young and you've got a family. Then that's why people had tribes, wasn't it? They were in their families, and even if they didn't agree with each other, they had a loyalty and trust with each other.
Yeah. But they also had a hierarchy with elders and youngers, and you defer to that hierarchy whether you like it or not. You, if you have rules and responsibilities, then someone has to impose those rules and someone has to follow them. And I think that's where sometimes these intentional community ideas start to fall apart, because everybody wants to be equal. And but then, if someone doesn't pull their weight, what are the consequences? So it's an interesting one to explore. And if anyone is listening and has ideas or thoughts, we'd love to hear them. Um,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
governance, how we govern ourselves, is such a vital question. I mean, I've been looking at various sort of things as well because I really question, how do we live together?
Hmm.
Yes, we've got to find a way, haven't we? Because if we don't find our own way of how we do it, other people will impose their way of how we do it.
Yeah.
And that's not sounding too good at the moment.
Absolutely. And then the alternatives to that is that you just become an island. You and whoever you handpick to be, maybe it's your family or maybe it's just you and your husband, you just become this island. And then that itself can be isolating, but it can also be a bit of a danger because, if you have things and others don't, and you have to decide how and where you'll share that, and you can become a target. So I know that's one of the things that you've talked about, but you've also talked about it not so much from a physical perspective, but also from a mental perspective, preparing yourself in ways that psychologically strengthen you. So let's talk about that a little bit.
I think that's the most important thing to do now. And I think it's part of how we evolve. And one of the things that we've done is we've confused evolution with progress. But evolution is really about adapting. And I don't know if you've come across the work of Jem Bendor,
No.
Deep Adaptation. That was another turning point for me because we'd spent sort of years in the wilderness of being eco warriors and wearing the hair shirt and living off the land as much as we could, and noticing that nobody was taking any notice whatsoever and nothing was changing. And then a friend recommended reading Professor Jem Bendor's Deep Adaptation paper. And it literally is about that we're not going to stop this and that we just have to find ways to adapt. And
Hmm.
I think one of the best things is to prepare ourselves mentally and physically to be strong and healthy as possible, so that we are, yeah, so we can be reliant on ourselves, but also we can help others. If we're not in full capacity, then we are a burden rather than an asset.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to physically preparing, it's pretty clear the things that we need to do: stop putting poisons in our body and eating clean, whole foods, all of those things. But mentally preparing is something that we know that we need to do, but it isn't always as clear or easy to do. I mean, we talked already about how um, you know people just don't want to look at things that are too gruesome or too negative. They'll just put them aside and say, no, no, I'm not just not going to deal with that until I have to. Um, so, what are some of the ways that you yourself have strengthened that mental muscle?
It's a huge subject, and I think it's a lifetime's work. I can sort of touch on a few things. One is I've been a yoga practitioner for about 40 years.
Hmm.
So that's, started off as a sort of physical practice, but now it's much more about being centered, being grounded, having a strong core, meditation, taking time out into stillness. I think whatever you choose to do, it might be a walk by the river or watching a funny film, to do whatever you can that grounds you, that keeps you clear from all the traffic and the noise, I think is really important. So to have some sort of practices that sustain and nourish you. Um,
Um, I'll just mention, because I don't think we have mentioned it, but you do have a background in psychology and in coaching and training, and so this is not only something that you've done in your own personal practice, but it's also something that you did in your corporate work. So I just wanted to mention that you have actually credentials to talk about this. Um, and a follow-up question is that the idea of doing things that center us and that calm us um, may not always be that easy to do, because we all lead busy lives, but they're easier to do um, at times when the world hasn't completely blown up. But when we're in a pressure situation, when we're in a crisis, whatever that crisis might look like, maybe there's an earthquake or it's some human disaster. What are some of the ways that you would recommend people being able to kind of overcome fear? Because fear is definitely not the place we want to find ourselves in.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of that, and a lot of it is manufactured. And I think one of the most important things is that fear is created in our bodies, but it's usually indicated by the type of thinking that we've got. And so, and it does take rigorous training. It's not an easy thing to do, but to actually stand outside yourself for a minute and just say, what am I actually frightened about? What's this fear? What is it? Where is it in my body? And can I just take a few deep breaths? Is it something that I can action in some way? Does it even have a cause, or is it just a general feeling of anxiety and overwhelm, which I think is very, very prevalent at this time?
Mhm.
So I think it takes a discipline. It's not something that's a quick fix. There are lots and lots of resources, somatic exercises, breathing exercises, meditation. It might be going for a nice walk. It could be anything that just soothes your nervous system.
Mhm.
I think the other thing is not to not fantasize about having some utopia that we're all going to raise our consciousness and be delivered in some way, shape, or form, or it's all going to be Mad Max. None
Right.
of us know, and that's why the centering and the grounding is important, because it brings you back to the now. And with fear, you could be saying to yourself, what is there to be frightened of in this moment?
It dovetails really nicely with this idea of courage, and going back to the theme of your Substack. Um, COVID was a great test run for what we would do when faced with tough decisions. And in a lot of cases in the society that we're living in, we noticed a real lack of courage, even just in simple decisions of, you know, um, if I don't do this, I might lose my job, or I might lose some social status, or other people might think X of me if I do or don't do this, wearing a mask, or um, getting a vaccine, or whatever those choices might have been that we were faced with. A lot of times people took the safe route rather than the courageous route. Um, and that wasn't the end of it. I think we're going to face those types of decisions again and again in the next few years. And so let's talk about that a little bit, and why courageous conversations is the theme of what you work on.
I think it does take courage. It does take courage to stand against the flow. And I was listening to Dr. Tom Cowan the other day, and he was saying he puts it all down to shame. That as a species, shame was the worst thing that could happen to us, almost, in terms of we would be ostracized alienated from the group, and we needed the group in order
Yeah.
to survive. And that, as we're still pretty primitive, aren't we? So that sort of fear of shame, of being ostracized, plays along. I mean, I think it's Tim Snyder in Tyranny. One of his first lessons is that do not comply before being asked.
Mm.
And I've noticed people are already complying before it's even been asked, because they're so frightened of being outside what's expected of them. And I know for myself, having the courage to go into a shop not wearing a mask and being pointed at and talked about, I just thought I can withstand that.
Hmm.
That's not a big deal, because I don't believe, or being in a restaurant where somehow if you were sitting down, the virus couldn't get you. But when you stood up to leave or go somewhere else, you had to put a mask on again. The actual lunacy of it.
Right.
So you have to weigh up. Yeah, this is going to happen. I'm probably going to be ridiculed and shamed because I was told that I was putting other people in danger.
Right.
Or am I going to stick by my principles? And I think that's part of being centered. I think one of the most important things psychologically is really getting to know yourself about what are my values, what am I prepared to stand up for, and what am I willing to compromise on. And
Yeah.
COVID taught me a lot about that.
Yeah. I think that's such an important one because knowing what you stand for, knowing what your principles are and where something crosses the line is the way that you can say no. That's where I will not go further than that. But if we're just so caught up in the day to day, we get so busy and distracted, which is, imposed on us in a way, in so many ways. They want us to be distracted. We forget. We don't, it's not like you can sit down and say, if there's a pandemic and they require me to wear a paper mask on my face, what will I do? We didn't know ahead of time that that was going to be the decision that we would have to choose. But, some people just didn't know the implications or the symbolism of some of those choices. And so, as you say, compliance was just the easier thing to do, go along to get along. And others just had that sense deep within them that doing this is a slippery slope to so many other things and I'm just not going to. Part of that, as you said, is just connecting in with who you are, who you want to be, and then you get that visceral feeling, don't you, in your body about when something is right or wrong.
Yeah, and to them, to a lot of people, they were doing it with really good intention. They
Yes.
really believed that they were helping. So I don't criticize that. But I think we all have to make our own sort of decisions. And I think that's also part of the psychological strength in collapse, is whether you see this as an affliction, that poor me, this is happening in my time and playing victim, or whether you treat it as this is a time, this is an assignment that I have. I have to make decisions about who I'm going to be and how I'm going to act and get ahead of the game. If you're already thinking those things through, you're like 99% more prepared than the general population. So you're less likely to be running around like headless chicken when things do go wrong.
Yeah. What's your assessment of kind of where we are in this moment? Do you see hope on the horizon? Do you think we're bracing for impact?
I don't do hope. I really hate that word
Why?
because it to me it indicates passivity, and I prefer possibilities.
Hmm.
So I think we're bracing ourselves for impact, or should be. I think things are going to get tough and tougher, much tougher. And I don't know how it will go, but one of the things from psychological training and strength practices is that I can choose what I believe. If my
Mhm.
belief serves me, and I believe in possibilities, I believe in the human spirit, I believe that something will happen somewhere. And whether it does or not, at least I've tried. and I'm with other people who are trying as well. And that gives me courage and that gives me strength. So I prefer actions and possibilities to hope.
I like it. That's great. You talked about just in the idea of clarifying words. You had talked about rather than the idea of an island of sanity in an insane world. You had talked about creating an island of coherence rather than sanity. What does
Yeah,
that mean?
the Islands of Sanity comes from wonderful work by Meg Wheatley. And I thought about it, and then I saw a Krishnamurti quote which says, "To be sane in an insane world is not a sign of health." So I thought, is that what we really want? And also, it has some sort of judgment that everybody else is insane. And I think everybody else is just doing the best they can. I think that to have compassion for people in struggle, in whatever form it's taking. And coherence for me is consolidating what we've already talked about really being clear about who I am, what I stand for, what really matters to me, what my priorities are, and who I want to be. And I might not be that person now, but I'm working towards it. And this is the person I want to be when things are really in crisis. Do I want to be that person, using violence to get to something? Or am I going to have some compassion and some kindness and some generosity? I don't
Mhm.
know, but that's what I'm working towards.
That's great. If people listening to this hear us talking about collapse, what do you want them to take away from that concept?
That we do have power, that we're stronger than we recognise we are, that we're being kept deliberately weak, and that this is not unusual in history. Things collapse, things get renewed. It's not unusual in life. We've all overcome things. It's nothing to be frightened of. This is something that we can prepare for and adapt. And our ancestors survived, they endured. We can. It'll be in a different format, it'll be in ways that we can't even imagine. But we have the strength and the resources and the power to do that.
I think that's a great message. I like your idea of taking words and refining them. So maybe we need to think about this not as collapse, but as renewal, just as nature, a leaf falls from a tree and it goes back into the forest floor, comes back as some other form. That's potentially what we're going through right now.
And it's needed because many of us recognise that the systems that we and the institutions that we have in place are no longer serving us, or even if they ever served us. And so they do need to go. And, you could call it the great unravelling, like Joanna Macy, or an apocalypse, or whatever term you want. But this is a time of renewal and it is a time of opportunity for us. But we have to be ready and we have to look for those opportunities.
Amen. I agree completely. Susan, remind people how they can find you, connect with you, and read more of your work.
Well, I'd love to connect with people. I really like being on Substack. I started Courageous Conversations to explore issues like this. And I write mostly weekly. And I also share a poem that I have chosen because I think it's really important that we're creative, we're joyful, and we find beauty. That is resistance as well.
Fantastic. Well, there's lots more to talk about. So we do hope that you'll come back and keep us posted about what's going on in the UK and what collapse is looking like there.
I would love to. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for your great questions.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Friends, that was Susan Harley, a voice of reason and resilience and resistance in a world that often prefers comfortable lies. You can think of her as Collapse Life's UK correspondent, but with poetry. If her message resonated with you, I encourage you to check her out on Substack and share this episode with someone who needs to start thinking differently. At Collapse Life, we're not here to panic anyone. We're here to help prepare and to question and to build what comes next. You can learn more about us at collapselife.com. And if you feel inclined, please help support us on our Buy Me a Coffee page. We're grateful for every drop of caffeinated goodness, so thank you in advance. And thank you for being with us today. We will be back again next week, and we hope to see you. And in the meantime, just remember to keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.